Hello, welcome to today's session of History and Methodology of Economics. Today's topic are the intellectual roots of neoliberalism, the Austrian school, and German Ordoliberalism. After the Great Depression and the war, the liberal approaches towards economic policies were at setback. They were replaced by interventionist policies inspired heavily by the legacy of John Maynard Keynes. However, the liberal thinking remained active and returning back after several decades in the 1970s and then mainly in the 1980s, and it remained prominent since then. That means that the economic thinking, the liberal economic thinking, which considered the state as a leviathan, as in the old liberals like John Locke and to some extent Adam Smith as well, this liberal thinking does not disappear after the Second World War. Even the proponents of those liberal schools aimed to provide some credible explanation of the Great Depression and propose some solutions for economic recovery. However, the credibility of liberal thinking was seriously harmed because the liberal policies were considered as one of the causes of Great Depression, which then made a space for the war. The main topic of this session, as it's been said, are the Austrian school and to some extent also the so-called liquidationism, which is connected with the US tradition and UK tradition of economic thinking before John Maynard Keynes, and with the German order. We'll talk also about the German Ordoliberalism. Interestingly, those schools of thought have had a marginal impact on the methodology of economics, and some proponents were simply considered as outsiders at their times. However, all the thinkers which we will discuss today had really a large impact on political philosophy and economic policy, and their contribution to those areas is without discussion. There are 4 readings suggested for this session. The first is the essay by Ludwig von Mises, which describes the Austrian theory of the trade cycle from 1936. Quite a difficult text of a few pages, but it describes the very essence of Austrian thinking about macroeconomics. The second text by J. Bradford DeLong from 1990 describes the so-called liquidation cycles. It's called the old-fashioned real business cycles theory and the Great Depression, and Alois Schumpeter. Then there were 2 texts by Ralph Dack and Jens Hien, focused on Ordoliberalism in Germany. We'll start with the Austrian school. There are in general 2 generations of Austrian school. The Austrian school was originated in the late of 19th century and in Vienna, and was characterized by contributions especially in microeconomics within the so-called marginal revolution. The main proponents were Karl Menger, Friedrich Bieser, Eugen Böhm-Bawerk, and others. Most of the concepts that were developed at the time were incorporated in mainstream. However, in the mid of the 20th century, the Austrian school was almost forgotten. The proponents focused more on monetary policy and money as such, but they lived outside of the mainstream. There were several reasons for that. One of them was that their strict methodological individualism did not allow for aggregate macroeconomic analysis, and after the Great Depression what was really needed was a framework for macroeconomic analysis. Furthermore, Austrians never really accepted econometrics, and econometrics started to be accepted as a main tool as one of the main tools together with mathematical models in economics. Still, even today's, it's kind of fashion to be called as Austrian, especially among policy makers of the right wing of political spectrum, especially in Anglo-Saxon world. Here are the main proponents of Austrian economics depicted, with some quotes which characterize their thinking. There's Karl Menger, who was just a bit younger than Karl Marx, and his quote says that man himself is at the beginning and at the end of every economy. You can feel the contradiction to Karl Marx's thinking, which is about class struggle. Here, the focus is on a man, on an individual, and it implies the methodological individualism, which means that in the explanation of all economic phenomena we have to go back to the actions or inactions of individuals. It is thought and assumed by the proponents of Austrian economics of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century that groups or collectives cannot really act except through the actions of individual members. The second person depicted here is Eucken von Mises. Value does not come out of the workshop, but out of the wants which goods satisfy. This statement is again directed against Marxist theory of value, which is connected with labor, which is the labor theory of value. Karl Marx stated that the value of each good is characterized with the value of with the amount of labor embedded there. Eucken von Mises and other Austrians put a completely different concept of theory of value, which is now related completely to price. It is independent on labor, it is reduced to price, which are related to relative scarcity of particular goods and to opportunity costs needed for their payment. The two other proponents belong to the second and perhaps even to a third generation of Austrian school, and these are Ludwig von Mises and Murray and Rothbard. Those two extended the thinking of the first generation of Austrian economics, and both of them, both Ludwig von Mises and Murray and Rothbard, became strongly focused on ultra-liberal thinking, on very liberal thinking, which rejects any positive role of the state. So Ludwig von Mises, only the individual thinks, only the individual reasons, only the individual acts. And Murray and Rothbard, government attempts to prevent a few future invasions by committing permanent invasion against everyone. You can feel how hostile attitude towards the state is expressed in those attitudes. Ludwig von Mises, what he added to the principles of marginalism and marginal revolution developed by the first generation of Austrians. It's been the concept of consumer sovereignty stretched to the extremes. Here's a quotation written later on by Fritz Machu, that the influence consumers have on the effective demand for goods and services through prices which result in free competitive markets on the production plans of producers and investors is not merely a hard fact, but also an important objective, which is attainable actually only by complete avoidance of governmental interference with the markets and of restrictions on the freedom of sellers and buyers to follow their own judgment regarding quantities, qualities, prices of products and services. This very short paragraph basically says and states how important are prices for signals which come from consumers to firms through their purchases. But these signals are valid only under the condition that the prices are set in free competitive markets. So they are reliable and attainable only if the government stay aside of the market and doesn't intervene there at all. If it does so, then what here Mises states, they restrict the freedom of sellers and buyers. So you can feel here the distinction between, perhaps not a distinction, a link which is put between prices, free markets, and individual freedom. The second component which is added is political individualism. Only when individuals are given full economic freedom will it be possible to secure political and moral freedom. Restrictions on economic freedom lead sooner or later to an extension of coercive activities of the state into the political domain, underpinning and eventually destroying the essential individual liberties which the capitalist societies were able to attain in the 19th century. Again, here economic freedom is considered as a precondition to political and moral freedoms. And if the state tries to restrict the economic freedom, there is again a link that it will destroy the political freedom as well. These ideas by Austrian school made the Austrian school very popular among liberals and among all those who believed that the role of the state should be the lowest. Until today, they find inspiration in the works by Ludwig von Mises and also by others like Friedrich August von Hayek, who's famous first for his writings in business cycles and monetary theory, but then much more for his contribution in liberal philosophy and the debate on the possibility of socialism. He also received a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1974, and true is that he is today more famous for his contribution to political philosophy rather than in economics. Fritz Machlup wrote several pieces and important contributions on the role of knowledge, and he was one of the first who considered knowledge and information as an important factor of production and as an economic resource. Marie Rothbard extended and continued with the models of business cycles and monetary theory, which has been done by Ludwig von Mises, and he rejected central banking almost completely, and he was very much against fractional reserve banking that dominates today's economies. Finally, I'm adding here to the Austrian school also the Josef Alois Schumpeter for his work in business cycles and economic development, even though there is some dispute whether he shall be considered as a member of Austrian school or not, because in his work the driving factor of business cycles are not money, as in Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich August von Hayek, but he focuses much more on the productive side of the economy. But the mechanisms and also the political implications are quite similar to Austrian economics. So that's why I think he can be considered as a proponent of Austrian School of Economics, of economic thought as well. In the class, we will discuss mainly the Austrian theory of trade cycle, or sometimes referred as Austrian business cycle theory, ABCT. It will be focused on the works by von Mises and von Hayek, and it will be related to the to the paper by von Mises. We'll discuss the following questions, like was the source of cyclical deviations in Austrian business cycle theory, what causes the swift into recession and causes then a return to prosperity after such a bust. And we'll also think about the appropriate role of the government or of the central bank in the economy, according to Mises, and we'll also try to discuss how the theory is related to Minsky's hypothesis of financial stability, and how does it differ from each other. The second theory of business cycles, which been quite famous at that time, which in fact reflects the U.S. liberal tradition. It's the liquidationism, mainly or best described in the works by Josef Alois Schumpeter in the 1930s. The other proponents, again, Friedrich, August Hayek, Leonard Robbins from London School of Economics. I'm adding here a famous summary of the liquidationist approach expressed by former U.S. President Herbert Hoover in his memoirs. The leave it alone liquidationists, headed by the Secretary of the Treasury Mellon, felt that government must keep its hands off and let the slump liquidate itself. He's talking about the Great Depression and the years 1930 till 1932. Mr. Mellon had only one formula: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. He held that even panic was not altogether a bad thing. He said it will purge out the rottenness of the system out of the system, and high costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life, values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up of the breaks of the less competent people. You can feel there again the link between austerity to some extent and between free markets and liberal thinking and moral philosophy. However, application of those policies wasn't really or cannot be considered as a success, because those liberal policies were unable in 1930s to assure a rebound in economic activity. The text which I've selected for liquidationism is the one by J. Bradford DeLong, and we'll discuss the concept of creative destruction by Schumpeter, and why Schumpeter believed that the creative destruction is the appropriate approach, appropriate cure for the economy which appears in a slack. And we will also try to discuss why those policies didn't really work in the Great Depression, but whether there are other cases when those policies can be justified or not. You can find them in the text that Bradford DeLong finds quite surprisingly several periods for which the theory of liquidationism appears quite reasonable. After discussing Austrian tradition, we move to Ordoliberalism, the specific form of neoliberalism which was developed in Germany by a group of German economists around the Freiburg schools. Most of those economists were also lawyers, and the school of thought, the Ordoliberal school of thought, was developed between 1930s till 1950s. And Ordoliberalism is currently considered as for its role, for the role of the proponents of Ordoliberalism in the German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic recovery and economic boom which appeared after the Second World War, which has brought unprecedented prosperity to a country which was completely devastated after the Second World War. In comparison to previous school of thought such as marginalism or Keynesian economics, it is rather a mixture of political philosophy and some attempts to to provide some theories and some underpinning for practical policy making. It's not a coherent economic methodology in its narrow sense. Still, it's considered as an economic school of thought because of its importance not only for Germany but also for today's European Union. The main proponents were for sure Walter Eucken. He's considered as a father of Ordoliberalism. Then we can add here Alfred Müller-Armack as a German economist who contributed with the social aspects to the Ordoliberalism, because the Ordoliberalism is also associated with the social Marktwirtschaft, social market economy. And one of the most famous Ordoliberals is Ludwig Erhard, German economic minister under Konrad Adenauer, and then also a prime minister for a few years in the 1960s, who's been the author of the economic reforms which set a ground for the economic prosperity of Germany of 1950s. Because of this evident success of the policies pushed by the Ordoliberalism, had always quite a good amount of credibility among policymakers, especially in Europe. Here are the two proponents, Walter Eucken and Ludwig Erhard. Walter Eucken was a German economist at the Freiburg School, and his thoughts will be discussed in the class because they are nicely reflected in the papers which are provided as underpinning for this session. And there's also Ludwig Erhard. However, I'd like to turn our attention also to one less known person from Germany, and it's Carl Friedrich Goerdeler. I always found quite surprising where the Ordoliberals appeared in Western Germany after the Second World War. And when trying to do some research about their backgrounds, about the backgrounds of main Ordoliberalism, it's quite interesting that most of the persons have some personal connections with this man, Carl Friedrich Goerdeler, who was born in 1884 and died and was actually executed in the spring of 1945, shortly before the end of the Second World War. Carl Friedrich Goerdeler was a conservative German politician. After 1920, he's been a mayor of city Königsberg, today is called Kaliningrad in eastern Prussia, and then since 1930 till 1937, he was a mayor of Leipzig. And not only being a mayor of two major cities in that time, Germany, Goerdeler was also active in German governments during the Great Depression. He was working as a price commissioner in the Brünings government, and he's been responsible for the deflationary policies which were supposed to help Germany to rebound from the Great Depression, although these policies were not successful, and they were able to, the German policymakers were able to put down the price levels, but still it wasn't enough to restart the economy, and those policies resulted in very high levels of unemployment in Germany. And Goerdeler, among others, belonged also to candidates for a chancellor in Germany in 1930s. He was supposed to replace Brüning, but then von Papen and Adolf Hitler were or received more support by President Hindenburg. And Carl Friedrich Gödel belonged also to a group of thinkers and economists who believed that the Weimar Republic has failed and that conservative revolution was needed to restore the German prosperity. That's why he was moderately supporting the Nazi regimes till about mid of 1930s. And however, shortly in the late of 1930s already, Gödeler became one of the representatives of German resistance against Hitler. Despite being against Hitler, he's been consistently preparing a long and detailed memoranda containing advices on economic policy, which were addressed to Adolf Hitler personally and also to his ministers. His ideas were very closely linked to the Freiburg School and to Ordoliberalism. For example, in the 1936 recession, he recommended deregulation and liberalization as a way how to restore prosperity of Germany. He also recommended devaluation of German mark. However, he's been against the inflationary policies pursued by that time German government. However, his proposals were not listened. Furthermore, later on, when the war was approaching to its end, he was in 1944 among the group of German politicians who prepared the coup of 20th July 1944. And if this coup had succeeded, Carl Friedrich Gödel would become Chancellor of Germany and would have been responsible for negotiating of the peace and also for the economic recovery. If Gödel would have been appointed, he started to prepare an economic program for the new German government, and he asked Walter Eucken as a main proponent of ordoliberalism to draft such a policy. He's been also linked to Ludwig Erhard. Ludwig Erhard worked during the war for Institut für Wirtschaftsbeobachtung der Deutschen Fertigware and then for Reichsgruppe Industrie. And late in 1943 and in early 1944, he prepared a study on how to recover Germany after the war, no matter that such thinking was considered as illegal that time. Still, his work called War Financing and Debt Consolidation, Kriegsfinanzierung und Schuldenkonsolidierung, were based on the idea that the war is lost for Germany, and he proposed there some scenario for economic recovery, for economic reform, and he discussed these ideas with Gödel as well, and Gödel was highly impressed by those ideas and recommended Ludwig Erhard also to his colleagues and his fellows. So, if we are thinking where Ordoliberals came from, the ashes of Germany destroyed by the war, we can see that the German Ordoliberals were not only to some extent proponents of the German resistance, they were also linked to parts of German administration and German elites who were consistently thinking how to rebuild the economy after the war. That means that they were placed on the right place and in the right time, and they were also prepared for the challenges which appeared after the war. In our class discussion, we will discuss the attitudes of Ordoliberals towards the Weimar Republic, because from this we can derive the attitude of Ordoliberalism towards the state, and we will learn that for Ordoliberals, state actually is a kind of a solution and cure of some of the peculiarities of liberalism. We'll discuss why Ordoliberals focus on a competition policy, and also the concepts of social market economy and how it evolved in Germany. Finally, we'll discuss the elements of Ordoliberal thinking which explain which help to shape the policies in the European Union, including the policies of the Great Recession, which were very strongly focused on reduction of debts rather than on debt forgiveness, which helped Germany after the Second World War. So we'll discuss this paradox as well. Let me finish this session with a few notes on legacy of both schools. Austrian business cycle theory and Ordoliberalism are skeptical towards interventions of the state, but the solutions of both schools are different. While Austrian business cycle Austrians in fact reject any positive role of the state, for Ordoliberals they found some place where the state could be really useful. It's mainly in the competition policy and antitrust policy, and so they just come up with some solution, and they try to place also themselves between the socialism and between the laissez-faire liberalism. Nevertheless, despite all those differences, the main proponents of both schools were very active in attempts to save the liberal thinking and to be prepared for a new era, and they were very active in liberal think tanks. Among others, they were among the founders and most prominent leaders of the Montpellierin Society, which has been then central in Keynesian displacement of the 1970s. The Montpellierin Society was founded in 1947 on the onset of Cold War. It's been founded by Friedrich August von Hayek, Karl Popper, Ludwig von Mises, Frank Knight, Milton Friedman and others. And its main goal was to facilitate an exchange of ideas between like-minded scholars in the hope of strengthening the principle and the practice of a free society, and to study the workings, virtues and defects of market-oriented economic systems in the era of rising popularity of state interventionism, when the laissez-faire policies lost much of their credibility, and many people were impressed by socialism and communism and the powers of planning. So here's our Montpellierin Society, and I'd like to thank you for the attention, and I'm looking forward for the in-class discussion on the papers that were posted.